In contrast to the sugya of Shihia and Chazara, the Shitas Rashi in the sugya of Shihia and Chazara was a das yochid in the Rishonim. You will recall that the Hakdama to Perek Kira was that Shitas Rashi is that the Gezeira of Shihia and the Gezeira of Chazara are essentially the same Gezeira as the Gezeira of HATMANA. The Rishonim pointed out that Shitas Rashi is that the Mishnayos from the end of Bama Madlikin through Perek Kira, through Perek Bama Toimenim are all discussing Gezeiras which are around the Isser of HATMANA. Rashi learned that Shihia is a form of HATMANA. Chazara is a form of HATMANA. Rov Rishonim, as we learned then, are Chelek on Shitas Rashi, and saw the Gezeira of Shihia and Chazara as being unrelated to the Gezeira of HATMANA, and Rashi Shita was a Das Yochid in the Rishonim. In contrast, as we'll see Be'ezer Hashem Behemshech, in the sugya of the Isser of HATMANA, there are fundamentally two mahalchim in the Rishonim. One is Shitas Rashi and one is Shitas HaRav, based on two different girsois in the Gemara and Daf Lamed Daled, which we'll see. In this case, Shitas Rashi, just to quote the Lashon of the Rosh, Shitas Rashi Iker, v'Shitas HaRav Eino Iker. Rashi Shita is the defining Shita lahalacha in the sugya of HATMANA. So Be'ezer Hashem, in this limud, we'll learn the sugya on Daf Lamed Daled. B'Shitas Rashi, we'll try to be mamik as much as we're able in Shitas Rashi. B'li neder, in a further limud, we will then see the Shita of the Rif. The Gzeira of HATMANA is divided in the Gemara into two different possibilities, two different scenarios of HATMANA. In Rashi's Girsa, the first situation of HATMANA, which the Sugya describes, page 2 of the Maramakomis, the Gemara towards the bottom of the Amud. Omar Rava mipnei ma omru ein toimnin bedovar she'einoi moisif hevel mishechashecha. We're describing an act of HATMANA taking place on Shabbos, mishechashecha, and the form of that the HATMANA takes is HATMANA bedovar she'einoi moisif hevel. The reason for this distinction is because a HATMANA bedovar ham moisif hevel, the Gemara is going to go on to say, a second member of Rava, that's also even on Erev Shabbos. So in this part of the Sugi, we're addressing HATMANA b'Shabbos in a Dover she'eino moisef hevel. Rava's memory is, Mipnei ma omru ein toimnim b'dover she'eino moisef hevel. Why did Chazal make a gzeira of not being allowed to be toimen in a Dover she'eino moisef hevel? Zot the Gemara, Zot Rava, gzeira shema yartiach. There's a Gezeira, Rashi explains at the end of Dibra Masla Mishechashecha, Rashi says, Gezeira, Shemo Yimtsa Kederosoi Shenitztanano Keshayirtzelatmina. Perhaps when he comes to be Matmin the Kedera, he will find that his Kedera has cooled, V'yartichenot Chila, and he will then proceed to reheat the Kedera, V'nimtsa Mevashel B'Shabbos. So Rashi describes that when someone comes to be matmin a kedera, we are choishesh that he may find the kedera cold, and then reheat the kedera, which involves an iser bishul on Shabbos. Let's see the Rosh on page 25 of the Maramakomis. The Rosh is towards the end of Siman Yud. The Rosh is discussing a shaila of Hilchos Bishul, not Hilchos HATMANA. And the Rosh is describing possibilities of there being an Isser Bishul on something that has already undergone a process of Bishul, which we've encountered a number of times as a Machlokes Rishonim, whether there's an Isser Bishul Deiraisa from Mach or Ben Drusoy until Mavushal called Sarakoi, and whether or not in a Dovar Lach, something which is liquid, if it's cooled, is there an Issa Bishul Doiraisa to reheat it? So the Rosh's Maskana at the end of Siman Yud is that once something has already been heated, even in a liquid, there is no longer the possibility of being over bishul deraisa by reheating it. Let's see. We'll see the Rosh from 4 lines from the end of the Rosh in Siman Yud. Ulemayde Pashinon, based on what we've established at the Rosh. Once a tavshel has undergone bishul, even if it's a davar lach, and the fact that now it's tzoinen, it's lost its heat, there's no longer a possibility of being over bishul deraisa. The Rosh says, I have a kasha. The Gemara we just learned, Rava says the reason why you can't do HATMANA on Shabbos is Gezeira Shema Yartiach. Perhaps he'll reheat the Kedera. What's the problem with reheating the Kedera? The Kedera is already mavushal. And even if it's a Dovar Lach and has lost its heat, there's vaita no Isser of Bishul. So what's the problem of Gezeira Shema Yartiach? This is the Rosh's Kasha. So from the sugya of Bishul Achar Bishul by a Dovar Lach, the Rosh now asks a kasha in the sugya of HATMANA. So Rabbi say again, we're being oimed in the sugya of bishul achar bishul b'davar lach, and the Rosh then is saying, what could be the possible scenario of being martiach a kedera b'Shabbos at the point of HATMANA would be a problem. Zot the Rosh, hosom lav mishum bishul. It's not related to bishul. Elo mishum shemo yichate. In order to be able to reheat the kedera, what the person will do is he'll be mechate. So the gzeira that we have is similar to what we saw in the Rishonim in Shehiyah, where there's a gzeira shema yechate in order to make sure that the bishul proceeds. And the same way as we saw in the case of Chazara, there were Rishonim that held that the gzeira is in order that the kedera should be heated, there's a gzeira shema yechate. The Rosh says the Gezerah of HATMANA b'Dover Sha'onim Moisef Hevel is also a Gezerah of Shema Yechate. It's another form of the Gezerah of Shema Yechate. Bishul can't be, says the Rosh, because what's the problem of being Chayzer and being Mavashal, something that was already Mavushal, even if it was in its standing? Al Karchach says the Rosh, the issue is an issue of Shema Yechate. V'hai denokat harchok hartocho. That the Gemara says Shema Yartiach, which implies that the Isser is in the heating, Dovar Hatzorich laHatmana nokat. It means something that requires Hatmana in order to be able to maintain its heat. Not the Rosh. That we have a Chashash Shema Yechat. But Rabbi said that's not what Rashi says. We just saw Rashi that Rashi says, V'artichenot chilo v'nimtza mevashal b'Shabbos. So on that, the Rosh in Siman Yud Aleph continues, immediately following the Rosh that we just saw. V'Rashi pirish le'el gezeira shema yartiach gezeira shenit stanano k'sheyirtz latmino v'yaticheno b'tchila ba'oir v'nimtza mevashal b'Shabbos. Rashi says there is an issue of bishul b'Shabbos. So Zot the Rosh, al korchach Rashi shita is chaluk, and Rashi holds there is a possibility that even something that was mavushal could still have an issa deraisa of being mavashal it further. So the Rosh therefore says that Rashi is l'shitosoi, and the chashash of Shema Yechate is l'shitosoi. If we learn that something that was already mavushal could still have the possibility of an issa bishul further, for example, lachshen it stanin, if it would have an issa bishul when you're matiach again, then the chashash of Shema Yartiach means literally Shema Yartiach, and then issue is a chashash of bishul. Masha'inkin, if you hold there's no bishul achar bishul la'achar that it was nizbashal even by lachshen it stanin, then al korchach the gezerah of Shema Yartiach is a gezerah of chitui. So we have two oifanim in the Rosh, how to understand lefi the girsa of Rashi what the chashash of Shema Yartiach is. Kishebo lehatmin k'dei rosei shenit stanino. And he sees it's mitzunon. What will the issa be? Will it be an issue of chitui, or will it be an issue of bishul? That's the Rosh's two shittas. Now the Ramban in Milchamis, if you look on page 33 of the Maramakamis, so the Ramban in Milchamis is actually coming to explain why the Rif did not learn the Gemara like Rashi. And as we said, the actual Rif's shita in the Gemara is not going to be the discussion in today's limud. We'll Be'ez Hashem learn that shita in a further limud bli neder. But the Milchamas explains why the Rif rejected Rashi's Mahalach. The Balamor says, excuse me, that the Rif, says the Balamor, Hichlif Shita zu behilchaisav. The Rif reversed Rashi Shita, and the Balamor says, Upirusha Barak, Pirush Rashi. The most straightforward Mahalach in the Sugi is like Rashi. So Kedarkoi, the Milchamos, who comes to explain the Shitas Rif, emphasizes the koishi that the Rif had with Shitas Rashi. Zot the Ramban. Ubevadai koshehu lochush. Fourth line of the Milchamas, towards the end of the line. Ubevadai koshehu lochush. He says Rashi is chashash is very difficult to accept. She'im yimtza odom kedera tzoinenes yadlik esa or lechatchila v'yadlikeno k'moisha mefarshim. Says the Ramban, the chashash that he'll be madlik or v'yarticheno. He says shaloi nechshedu Yisrael al kachal hashabosais ve'ein kan srach kedei sheyitu badover. There's no confusion here that should make the person make the mistake of doing what the Ramban says is yadlik esa or v'yarticheno. Now, the Ramban is not referring to Rashi the way we have it. Our Rashi says that the chashash is he'll be mevashel. The Ramban is going in shitas harosh in Rashi that the chashash is shema yichate. Shema yichate. Zot the Ramban, what will he do in order to be able to be mechate? What's he going to do? He's going to be matmin the kedera and see that the kedera is tzoinenes. So what's he going to do? He's going to be madlik and eish. Zot the Ramban, the chashash of being madlik and eish we don't have. Zot the Ramban. Chashash of being madlik and eish we don't have. Now, Kipshuta, we can pause there and say that Rashi himself, l'shitosoi, who's discussing chashash bishul, there is certainly a srach of why the person would be toyeh, to be mevashal the kedera again. Very simple. HaRav, the kedera was once mevushal. And there are Rishonim that hold that once something is mevushal, ain't bishul achar bishul. It's a chiddush that lachshen it stanin, something liquid that's cold, has again an isser of bishul. The Tos is very simple. That the person will think that since it already was mevushal kol tzarek, I can mevashal it again. That would be the srach. We could also add another nekuda. Let's go back briefly to the Rosh on page 25 of the Maram Mekaymas. If we read the Rosh carefully, there's a word in the Rosh that we looked over. When the Rosh explains Shitas Rashi, again, Siman Yud Aleph, where the Rosh is being oimed on Shitas Rashi. Rashi's girsa is V'chein le'el beperik kamo. The Rosh brings another instance where Rashi holds there is a possibility of bishul even after it wasn't his bashul. Zot the Rosh. V'chein beperik kamo gabi yoyra akura, Gemara that we learned together, where there's a yoyra that's dye, a pot full of dye. To porich v'haloi megis, that there's a chashash that the person will stir the pot in order for the bishul to proceed. Upirish Rashi, ubumuvushal have a bishul, even if the bishul has already started, there's still the possibility of bishul achar bishul. And Zot Rashi, that's midirabonon. Zokta egle tal, it's mavur over here in Rashi that possibly the nidin of a dover lachshen itztanin may only be an issa dirabonon to be mavashal it again. Says the Bach, if you look, the Bach takes out those words in the Rosh and he says it doesn't mean the Rosh, the word midrabonon should be taken out. But there's a possibility that we're only dealing with an issa dirabonon here, and Chachamim would go there even for the possibility of an issa dirabonon. So that would be another srach. So here we have an afkamina between if the chashash is shema yevashel or the chashash is that he'll be madlik and eish. The Ramban says that he'll be madlik and eish in order to be able to be mechamim the kedera. We were never chayshish. Rashi, that's not shittas Rashi. Rashi lefoneinu is the chashash is he'll simply be mevashel the kedera. So we have two svaras why there's such a chashash. Either because it's already mevushal kol tzarkoi and maybe he'll think it's mutter, or because there's a possibility that we may not be discussing actually in Issa Deraisa directly. So these are one or two possibilities b'Shitas Rashi, as we have the Gersa in Shitas Rashi. But the Ramban understood b'Shitas Rashi, and that's what the Rosh explains, is his Shita b'Shitas Rashi, that the Chashash is the Chashash of Hadlakas HaEsh. He'll be Madlik in Eish b'Shabbos. So let's now proceed further, assuming like the Ramban, that Shitas Rashi is that Shema Yartiach means the Chashash that he'll be Madlik in Eish.
What Rashi, that the Zora should be the same thing. If he brings him a cold,
we'll get to that in a moment, Be'ez Hashem. So the Nida now, which we'll be discussing as we proceed, is the way both the Rosh and the Ramban understand Shitas Rashi, that the Gezer of Shema Yarticheno means in the Lashon of the Ramban. Again, let's see the Lashon of the Ramban on page 33 of the pages of the Maramakomis. The Lashon of the Ramban is that B'Shitas Rashi, Lochush, the Chashashish, Yimtza Odom Keder Mitzunenes, Yadlik Esa Or Lichatchila V'Yadlikeno, he'll light an Eish. Lashon Ramban.
Which is a Gzera we never found before.
And the Chashash, if we want to add, we will recall a Shita of the Hagos Maimonides that we discussed, La Halacha, brought in Shulchan Aruch, in the Neisa Kelim of Shulchan Aruch, Magen Avraham Gepaskin to the Mishnah Berurah. We'll remember that there's an Issa L'Shita Satoisis Gepaskin to the Ramah of being Machzir Be'erev Shabbos. The Achroinim bring a Hagos Maimonides that says that Luyat Suyur, what we're machzir to the Kedera is not yet Mavushal Kamachol Ben Jusoi. There's no issue of Chazara. Because Bevadai, he won't be machzir that to a Kedera B'Shabbos to be over an Issa Deraisa Mamish. So Zot the Ramban, Nechshudu Yisrael to be Madlik in Eish B'Shabbos. Lo Yitachim. That's the kasha of the Kushiyat Tzuma of the Melchamas of Rashi, on Rashi. And he says that's the whole basis of the Shita of the Rif, that the Rif was Mahapich the Gemara, which we'll see Be'ez Hashem. Now, let's ask a number of very basic kashas on Shitas Rashi, straightforward shilas in the Havana of Shitas Rashi. Let's see a Gemara on Daf Nun Aleph, Amud Aleph, page 7 in the Maramakomis. Towards the top of the Amud, a memra of Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, mutter lahatmin esatzoinin. We know that on Shabbos there's an Isser being matmin in the Dover She'ena Moisev Hevel. What about being matmin esatzoinin? Taking something cold and putting it in hatman. Now, what's the point of that? So Rashi says the point of being matmin is Rashi Dvar Masa mutter lahatmin esatzoinin mipnei hachamo shelo yochumu. Sun's rays are beating down on the Kedera, and it's being heated up by the sun, which is going to cause the Tavshil to be miskalkel. So therefore, it's going to be wrapped. It's going to be mutman in order to protect it from the chama. Rashi says, what's the chiddush? And we don't say that since this is the same act of hatmana in order to keep something hot, we would be goyzer that it's also Zot Rashi, that form of hatmana in order to protect it from heat is mutter. Now let's see a ran on this Rashi, page 38 of the Maramakomis. The ran begins on the very bottom of the right-hand column. Omer of Yehuda Omer Shmuel, mutter lahatmin esatzoinen, Pirush Rashi zam pnei hachama shelo yachumu, v'lo gazirin otu hatmana de kadeshi yachumu. V'nira midvarav zal, Zot the ran, we inferred from what implied by Rashi is, Dilahatmin esatzoinen kedei lechamamoi. If I want to be matmin something cold in order to warm it, afal pishu matmin bedover sheni moisev hevel oser. You can't take something cold and place it in a cover in order to warm it, even though it's not moisev hevel. There's no warming capacity. There's no heat generating capacity in the hatmana material. It's still oser. He says the Rambam holds not like that. The Rambam holds mutter lahatmin dover atzoyin b'Shabbos. That shouldn't get colder, namely to insulate it from cold, or in order to remove the cold that the Kedera already has. So we have a yesodistika machloikes, a fundamental machloikes, Rashi and the Rambam. This is what the Ran is establishing for us. Is there a heta to be matmin in the dover she'ene moisev hevel b'Shabbos where the intention is not to generate heat, but either to prevent further cooling or in order to remove the chill of the tavshil. Mutter or osir. Rashi says osir, the Rambam says mutter. So we have l'fshitas Rashi that lahofik tzinosoi, to take off the chill of an oichel, of a kedera, is osir b'Shabbos al yedei HATMANA. Now, kipshutoi, the bir hadvarim is that Rashi is l'shitosoi. That whenever someone encounters a kedera tzeinenes on Shabbos and wants in some way to allow the kedera to be warm, we have a chashash shema yatiach. So Mela Zot Rashi, if we'll allow what the Rambam wants, that we should be able to be matmin in a dover she'enim moisev hevel to remove cold, then again we have the chashash of shema yatiach. So Rashi L'Shitosai says that al karchach, that which the Gemara says, again back to the Lashon Gemara on page 7 of the Maramakamis, that the Rabbi Yehuda Mashmul was matir l'muter l'hatmin es hatzoinen. Al karchach is not in order to be able to allow warmth, but in order, the opposite, to preserve the state of cool, to preserve tzoinen. Zot Rashi mipnei acham. So therefore, l'sikum hadvarim, Rashi shita is that hatmana lahofik tzina is osir, furish in the Ram. Why? Rashi l'shitosoi. Because whenever we encounter kedera tzeinenes, there's a chashash shemeyatiach. So now, Rabbi say, we can ask a poshet kasha. Haga ba'atzmecha. We learned last week a Gemara about smicha b'Shabbos, the sugya on daf mem amud beis. Smicha b'Shabbos. If you look in the Maramakamis, that Gemara is on page 13 of the Maramakamis pages. A Gemara. Tonu Rabbanon mevi odom kitoin shel mayim umenichoy keneged hamadura. A person can take a container of water and place it opposite a madura, loy b'shvil sheyechumu, not to be mavashel it, b'shvil deraisa. Ella, what's the lashon of the Gemara? B'shvil shetofik tzinosan. Take off the cold. How is that possible to be mutter? To put it inside the HATMANA in order to be able to hafik tzinosoi, we're choishish that you're going to be madlik and eish, according to the Ramban and the Rosh, B'shitas Rashi. But to take a kedera tzinenes and start putting it keneged or eish, that avad is mutter. How could that be? Rashi says as soon as a person is oisek when the kedera tzinenes, even the hatmina, he'll be madlik and eish. We're choishish. The Rosh and the Ramban. But to take a Ketera Tzinenes and to be Mafik Tzinosoi, Kineged Hamadura, Mutter. Why aren't we choshesh that you're going to be Mechata the Eish? So we learned in the Rosh, it's Rochik Min Eish. We learned last week, Rabbi say, it's Rochik Min Eish, so therefore there's a Heker. So to put it inside a Hatmana, which is nowhere near the Eish, choshesh you're going to go be Madlik and Eish. But to be Masmich Kineged Hamadura, no, that's Mutter. It seems to be Pella. Rashi has a Yisoid Rabbi said that whenever we're being oisik in the Kedera Tzeinenes, Rabbi said, and their kasha lick the hearts from Shittas Rashi. Whenever we're being oisik in the Kedera Tzeinenes, Bol Hatmino, we're choishish that you're going to be Martiach the Kedera because Motza Kedera Tzeinenes. But to be Masmich a Kedera Tzeinenes, that's a Lamadura, that's what. Doesn't seem to have any Mahalach in Svar. How could one be awesome and one be mutter? That's the first kasha on Rashi. The second nakuda to be ma'ayin in Rashi is that the simple taich of Rashi, and I think that's what was being asked before, is not move on. It's not understandable what Rashi is saying. Rabbi said, let's return to page 2 of the Maramakamis and be medayik carefully in Lashon Rashi. Zot Rashi, end of Dibra Maskil, Mishach HaSheicha. Gezerah. The Gezerah is Shemo Yimtzok Deirosoi Shenitztaneno Kashayirtzelat Minov Yarticheno Lachatchil. What's the scenario Rashi is describing? What's the Metzias? He's coming to be matmin his kedera, and he finds that the kedera is cold. So therefore, he's going to be martiach the kedera. What happens if he wasn't coming to be matmin it? He just was coming to eat the tavshil, and he finds that his kedera has become tzeinenes. Then there's no chashash al bimartiach. How is HATMANA connected to this? He's coming to be matm in the Kedera. The fact that he's coming to be matm in the Kedera is not what made the Kedera tzenenes. He sees the Kedera, he's coming to be Eichel the Tavshil inside, and he sees it's standing. So we eat on Shabbos. The Rosh says, Klal Yisrael adukim ba'inei Shabbos. He wants a Tavshil Cham. So why isn't that itself a chashash that he'll be Matiach? Why is it relevant that he's coming to be matmin, that Luitzu, we would allow him to be matmin the Tavshil, then there's a chashash that if he finds it Tzayin, he'll be Matiach. What's the connection to HATMANA? We simply, Rashi over here is being mechadish, that we have a simple chashash that someone may see his Kedera Tzeinenes b'Shabbos. So if we give him a license to be matmin, then it will bother him that it's Tzayin, and we don't give him a license to be matmin, then he's not going to find it Tzayin, and it won't bother him. How is this makusha to HATMANA? What's a simple type of Rashi? What's Rashi saying? And somehow, if we ask HATMANA, we're not allowing him to approach his Kedera b'Shabbos? Then he's not going to see it's Nitztanano, he's not going to care it's Nitztanano? Why is that related to HATMANA b'chlal? So we have Rabbi Salisikum Hadvarim, 3 nekudas in Rashi, which are tone bir. The first is the kash of the milchamis on Rashi. That if we learn like the milchamis and the rosh, that the issue in Rashi is chashash that he'll be mechato madlik ge'esh. Where do we find such a chashash b'Shabbos? Secondly, we have a shaila that Rashi l'shitosoi doesn't allow any hatmana on a kedera tzeinenes. L'shitosei, because as soon as you have an asek with a kedera tzenenes, you're going to be matiach, even if it's lahafik tzinosa. Zot the Rosh, Zot the Rambam is matir hatmana lahafik tzinosa, but Rashi not. So how then is it mutter to take a kitin shalmaim tzeinen and put it keneged amadura? You'll be mechamim directly, and we're not chayshish that you'll be mechato, will be maver and eish. And thirdly, how b'chlal do we understand the scenario that Rashi is describing? The concern that the Kedera is Nitztanon has anything to do with his intended Atman? So Rabbi Zalman in Even HaOzel opens the sugya of Hatmana in Shitas Rashi for us by establishing a yisoid, which Be'etzem we'll see in the Hemshech Halimud B'nei there is really mavur in Rashi in Kama Makaymas. But Be'ez Hashem from Rabbi Zalman will have a different Havana in Oimek Shitas Rashi of what the Gzeira of Hatmana is. Rabbi Zalman is in Perek Dalet Halacha Beis of Rambam in Hilchos Shabbos, and Rabbi Zalman comes to address the kasha that the Milchamas asks on Rashi. Where do we have a chashash? Where do we have a chashash that person will be mavir eish b'Shabbos? Where does that come from in Shitas Rashi? Where did Rashi see such a chashash?
Thank you.
So Rabbi Zalman says the following cheshbon. He says a davar nifla Rabbi Zalman. He says Rashi and the Cholkim in Rashi are l'shitosam. Abai said the Yisoid of Perek Kiros, the Machloikis Chananya and the Chachomim. Lishois Tnan ulahachzir Tnan. Is it mutter to be masha a kedera that was mavushal only kemachol ben drusoi on a kira that's not goruf and kotum? Is it mutter or aser? Machloikis Chananya and Chachomim, Machloikis Rishonim, how we pass. Rashi on the Lamed Zayin with Beis paskins like Hananya. Rashi b'teich dvarov paskins like Hananya. Therefore, according to Rashi, tavshil that's not mevushal kamachal ben drusoi can go on a kira that's not gorif and kotum erev Shabbos. The Rif udiimei many rishonim paskin not like Hananya. They paskin like the Chachomim lishes tanan. And therefore, until the Kedera is Mavushal, Kol Tzarkoi, and according to some Rishonim, Mitztamik Viraloi, cannot be put on a Kedera that's not Garif and Kotum. So Zot Rabbi Zalman, imagine the difference between the Erev Shabbos Welt of Rashi and the Erev Shabbos of the Rif and the Rambam. Is the Rashi's Balabusta and the Rif and the Rambam's Balabusta. Lefi Rashi that we paskin like Hananya, most Kederis Erev Shabbos are on a kira that is not Gorif and Kotum. It's Mavushal Kamachol ben Drusoi.
Don't need a blech.
Don't need a blech. In Rashi's Balabusta, so to speak, are putting their tafshilim aloish. No problem. Why?
Cooked.
Most tafshilim, by the time it's Erev Shabbos, is Mavushal Kamachol ben Drusoi. But if it's a Sudas Alayla, it's going on a kira that's not Gorif and Kotum. Meidach Gisa, the Riffen, in the Rambam's Kirch, rather not. Roiv Tavshilim, which are either not yet Mavushal called Sarko, even Mavushal called Sarko, Mitstamak V'Yofalo, Kuntimeni Rishonim, still need Garf and Kotum. So the Fishitas Rashi, the usual scenario of Shehiyah Be'erev Shabbos is on top of a Kira that is not Garf and Kotum. According to the Rif and the Rambam, Punkt Fakert. The straightforward scenario would be on Garf and Kotum. Zot the B'Sez Alman, Lefidus Hamtzah, it's not Shver B'chlal. Because the reason why Lefishitas Rashi there's a chashash of chitui or being mavir eish is because the eish isn't garf and kotum anyway in the usual scenario. The reason why the Ramban Leshitas Rif is matmiya and says, is there a chashash of being madlik eish? Is poshut. Because Lefi the shita of the Rif would made the stam of Shehiyah is on garf and kotum. Garf and kotum means there's no chashash chitui, and you are mesalik the gecholim. So in order to be able to have eish, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to be madlik an eish mitchila. So memela Rashi l'shitosai never had the kasha, and the Rif l'shitosai can't understand shitas Rashi. It's simply totally what hanocha you make. What is the basic presenting mitzias of Shehiyah? Now, before we go into the well, it's Shema Yavashal is Rashi L'Shitosai, and Shema Yechat is the Rosh and the Ramban. We don't know that. Rashi Lefonenu says Bishul. If Rashi holds of Chashash Chitu himself, perhaps Anachanami, Rashi himself may be moided to the Ramban, that there's no actual Chashash of Shema Yavir Eish. That's why we're always distinguishing between two Mahalchim in Rashi Shita, the way we have Rashi and the Ramban and the Rosh. I'm sorry?
You wouldn't need to come on to Shema Yavashal.
Well, Adarab, Shema Yavashal is less of a Chiddush than Shema Yechata. That we see from the Ramban. Shema Yechata, the Ramban says, what is not, we don't have a chashash for that will be madlik eish. Mashenkin Shema Yavashal is not necessarily. We don't know. We don't. It's not. We don't have a Rishon that says both. We have Rashi Lefonenu that says Bishul and the Rosh and the Ramban that says Chitu. Correct. That way, it's not muchrach. It's mistaber that Rashi didn't say it because of the Ramban's question that we won't be chayshish v'chitu. Why the other Rishonim didn't say bishul, the Rosh tells us, is because there's no issue of bishul acha bishul. That's what we have in the Mefurish and the Rishonim. More than that, we could possibly suggest, but we don't have it Mefurish. So, before we proceed in the cheshbon of Rabbi Zalman, Rabbi Zalman has opened up in the sugya of HATMANA a very basic yisoid, which we'll see is mavur and shittas Rashi and kama makomis. That when we're describing a situation of HATMANA, with HATMANA means something is taken from a state of shehiyah and put into HATMANA. The sugya of HATMANA b'Shabbos, Omar Rava, mipnei ma omru, ein toin medover she'enei moisiv hevel. That hatmana b'dover moisiv hevel is not happening in a vacuum. It's not that there's a kedera that is warm that the person wants to be matmin. It's that there's a kedera that's being oimed al ha'eish, and the person wants to be mesalik the kedera from the eish and place it in a matzav of hatmana. That is where the gzeira of hatmana is, that when the person is then going to take his kedera from shehiyah to hatmana, he'll see that the kedera was nitztanen, and what's he going to do? He's going to be mechata the eish that the kedera is on. Replacing the eish. So, and we'll see in a minute why he does that. But Lashon Rashi is meduik like that. Bekama mekayimos. Rashi explains Dibra Maschel Roischei saying one example of a Rashi, bottom of page 2 of the Omid Gemara that we're on. What says Rashi? What happens bein hashmashos when a person is matmin? Hu ma'avira me'al ha'oyer. The hatmana is being done by taking a kedera off the oyer and being matmin it. That's the basic presentation of how hatmana takes place. Similarly, there's a Lashon Rashi, which we'll see in the beginning of Perek Bamatoimnin. On page 4 of the Mara Makaimis, this wasn't included originally in the Limud, but it's Kedai to add this Lashon Rashi. It's Rashi in Bamatoimnin, page 4 of the Mara Makaimis, the page is printed opposite on the left-hand side. Bamatoimnin. Habol salik kedera me al gabe kira uletoimna bedover acher. We're speaking about Hatmana b'Shabbos, Right? Rashi says that Mefurish and Lamed Al Amud Aleph. We're speaking about Hatmana b'Shabbos. Rashi explains, how does Hatmana take place? Hatmana takes place that something is removed from Shehiyah and placed in a state of Hatmana. That's what Hatmana means. It means retaining the heat of the Shehiyah by no longer leaving it alo eish and placing it in a state of Hatmana. Now, why would a person do that b'mitzias? Why not just leave it alo eish? We'll come back to that. But what's relevant to us is in the structure of the gezerah of Hatmana. Chachamim were being goyzer on being matmin from Shehiyah to Hatmana. You'll recall, Rabbi Yisai, in last week's limud, we discussed Shitas HaChazon Ish from Smicha to Shehiyah. But we learned together in Yerushalmi that the Mogen Avraham brings in the Rambam Paskins. What about from Hatmana to Shehiyah or from Shehiyah to Hatmana? Is that mutter or not? Is that chodo p'maiseh or not chodo maiseh? So we asked, what's the havamina? From Shia to Hatmana, from Hatmana to Shia. What's the connection between Shia and Hatmana? The teretz is the basic mitzius, the basic geder of the gzeira of Hatmana is from Shia to Hatmana. Habol salik de rosem al gabe kira, and now he's coming to be matmin. Then now you'll see it's tzoyinin, and it'll come to be martiach v'kira. Mele Rebbe Zalman now says a cheshbon nifla that Rashi's chashash and the Rif's koishi with that chashash are l'shitasam. Why? Because since we've defined Hatmana as a siluk me alo eish into Hatmana to preserve the chayim of the eish in a steady state, in the form of Hatmana, Mimele Zot Rebbe Zalman, the chashash is that if we see that the kedera was standing al gabi kira, you'll come to be mechamim the kedera. Because the chashash addresses the kira which the kedera was on until now. And the mele l'shitosom, Rashi holds, that the stam kira is einoi gar for kotum, mele is a chashash. Lefi the rif, the stam kira is not gar from kotum. So is gar from kotum. Mimele, the chashash is that you'll refill the kira with gecholim. That is the cheshbon of Rebbe Zalman. But be'ikr, what's relevant to us is this: the assumption and the svara that Rebbe Zalman is presenting, that the yisoid of the Isser of Hatmana is because where it's being removed from a kira to Hatmana, the chashash is chiti being madlik eish in the kira that the shehiyah was taking place on until now. That's the yisoid that's mavur in Rebbe Zalman. Correct. This now allows us to answer the shaila that we had begun with, that according to Shitas Rashi, how is it mutter to take a kedera tzeinenes and put it kineged hamadura? Gemara Mefureshes, asking Shulchan Aruch. If you put it kineged hamadura, you can take a kedera tzeinenes, put it kineged hamadura. So we asked, ma doch a kedera tzeinenes? You can't put into Hatmana because we're chayshish you'll be madlig eish. If you put it kineged eish mamish, we're not chayshish that you'll come to either be mechatim madlig eish. It seems to be giurabara. The teretz is the fear of Rebbe Zalman. There's no shayches. We aren't chayshish that you'll stand be madlig in eish in a vacuum because you'll see that your kedera is nitstanin. That you'll take a kitan shamayim tzoinin and be madlik eish will be mavashal directly. The chashash is that because you're taking it away from a state of shehiyah, and you're putting it into Hatmana to preserve the heat of the shehiyah, Memela, when you see that the shehiyah hasn't provided heat, you'll come to be mechata. It's a very specific zera. But to put it kineged hamadura, that's the issue of that Apir Rebbe Zalman we can use to that shaila. Now, I'm sorry? We're going in, when we speak about Shittas Rashi, we emphasize that we're discussing Shittas Rashi, Lefi the Rosh and Lefi the Ramban. In Rashi himself, the Chashash Hashem Yivashal, we dealt with Alpi, either the Swara that we said that there's a Mokum Tos because of Bishul Achar Bishul, or like Fi the Eglei Tal that may only be a Chashash Rabban. So we madgish that we are discussing Shittas Rashi in the way it's understood by the Rosh and the Melchats. What's oimed lenegdeinu, the steer to this mahalach in Rashi, is because we saw that the Ran says that Rashi holds that HATMANA lahafik tzinasai is also. Abaysa, let's recall. We saw a Gemara on page 7 of the Maramakomis. Omar of Yehuda Mashmul mutter lahatmina satzainin. Rashi said, what's the mutter lahatmina satzainin? To prevent it being heated by the sun. The Ram said that Rashi didn't want to say it's in order to be able to warm it and take off the chill. Only the Rambam was mad to that. And we said that's because Rashi is l'shitosai, that whenever you're being oisik in a kedera tzeinenes and you're coming to somehow warm it, there's a chashash of shemayatiach. So we lost our whole mahalach. Here we see that you can take a kedera tzeinenes. It was never aloish. And lahofik tzinosai, Rashi says is aser. How do we understand that? So Muslim sagen, what's muchrach to say lefira b'sazalman's mahalach and shittas Rashi, is that once Chachomim made a gezeira that a Maisa HATMANA is aser, then they asered it across the board, even if the motivation is lahafik tzinosa only. Doesn't. As long as the Maisa that's being done is a Maisa HATMANA, then Chazal asered it across the board. It's only where the Maisa has nothing to do with warmth and it's just to protect from the sun, then Rashi says the Gemara was matir. That's the memra of the Gemara that mutter lahatmana satzainin. But as long as the hatmana in some way involves heat, even though it's not related to an eish, it's included in the gezeres chachamim of hatmana. But it's not because there's a chashash of shemayatiach, because there isn't. The chashash of shemayatiach is only related to hatmana that's subsequent to a shiyah. But where the hatmana is not subsequent to shiyah, we're saying there is no chashash of shemayatiach. Otherwise, there should be an isser of keneged amaduro, or b'chal having any asik with the kedera tzeinenes. Al Karchach, the reason why there's an Isser of Hatmana is because once Chachamim made the Gezer of Hatmana, every Maisa Hatmana is also. Now, if this is correct, then perhaps we can now have a mokum to be Noisev and Noisen in a Nifla B'Kakasha that Reb Shlomo Zalman asks. In Shulchan Shlomo, there's published from the Kisvei Yodas of Reb Shlomo Zalman the following Kasha, Kusha Nifla that Reb Shlomo Zalman asked. We began the limud by saying that in the sugya of Hatmana, Rashi Shita is the Iker Shita that the Poskim assume. Bes Yosef, Bach, Mogen Avram, Taz, all of the Gedolei HaPoskim, when coming to explain the Psak of the Shulchan Aruch, that there's an Issa to be matin b'Shabbos b'Dover she'enim Yosef Hevel, the reason is Gezeira Shemayatiach. If you want to see this, we can see on the Mishnah Berurah's pages. Page 14 in the Mishnah Berurah's pages, the very beginning of Siman Reish and Zayin. Ein toimnin b'Shabbos afilu b'Dover she'enim Yosef Hevel. There's an Isser Hatmana b'Shabbos and Dover she'enim Yosef Hevel. Zog the Mishnah Berurah. Le'achar she'nizbashal atavshel roitze la'tmina b'Dover she'yishmar chaymer. To preserve the chayim of the tavshel. V'osel ases came b'Shabbos. Zog the Mishnah Berurah. Why? V'taima, third line. D'shemo yimtza oz k'deirosoi tzeinenes v'yartichena D'chayev mishum avashel. So the Mishnah Berurah copies Shittas Rashi, that the issue is an issue of bishul. But where it says Rashi, what's the tam? What says the Mishnah Berurah, what's the tam? Shema yarticheno. Shema yimtza k'dei rosoi tzinenes v'yarticheno d'chayev mishum avashel. Zok the Shara Tzion Tzivkot Aleph, Mogen Avram v'hu b'Gemara. It's a straightforward way of reading the Gemara, the Chashash Shema yartichov mevashel. Then the Mishnah Berurah brings, and he says that filu leman the Omar the enu chayv mishum avashel bazeh. The Rosh.
Put up the Mishnah Berurah, please.
Kevon shenizbashel pam echod mikol mokem ikel lemigzah sheyem chamal gabe ha'esh v'yechata b'gicholim b'chayv mishum avir. Chashash chitu of the Rosh. So the Mishnah Berurah, it's one of the two.
Let's put up the Mishnah Berurah.
If there's an issue of chashash bishul, then it's like Rashi, it's chashash bishul, and the Rosh, it's an issue of chashash chitu. So we have the Mogen Avram have the Mishnah Hatzion being matik from the Mogen Avram, who's matik Shittas Rashi, that the basic tam, our approach to the whole gezerah of the Isser of Hatmana b'Dover she'enim Yosef Hevel b'Shabbos is the Chashash Shemayatiach, which means either bishul or chitui. Shittas Rashi in short.
14, page.
Shittas Rashi in short. Reb Shlomo Zalman.
Can we just, if the Ellen would like to see Sharatzian inside
I apologize. So page 14 in the Maramakomis. Page 14 in the Maramakomis. And the Sharatzian is Sifkat Nalef. Mogen Avram v'hu b'Gemara.
So what is rational by Yavish? When you respond by Yavish, what is rational by Yavish?
So in Echanami, so according to Rashi, which we'll see Be'ez Hashem in a further leap, but Rashi will have to hold that by Yavish, we will go on any Chazara Otu Alach. And we're not then mechalik between the Tafshil Yavish and Tafshil because the Chashash, that by a double lach, that be Bishul Deraisa.
That's in Gimel in the Sharatzi, no?
I'm sorry?
Gimel in the Sharatzi when you bring
Correct. If you want to see, it's correct. If
that's
just pointing
okay.
out, if you want to see it inside,
Yeah.
the Sharatzin says, "Lefiza afilu hu davar yavish lukuli alma im bisim shim bishul gam ken asal hatman," based on a prima gadol. We made a gezerah. Chacham made a gezerah across the board. Even if in a particular instance there wouldn't be, since by lach there's a chashash derai, so according to Agios and Osh, merely we have the gezerah. Now,
For the Prima Gadol.
it's a prima gadol. It's based on a prima gadol. Now, let's go back again to the Gemara on Daf Nun Amud Beis. Rashi Shita Omer of Yudom Shmuel, page 7 in the Maramakayimis, Mutter lehatmin esatzoinen. Zot Rashi again, why? When is it Mutter lehatmin esatzoinen? B'pnei achamo shelo yochum. The Ran emphasizes that means lahofik tzinosom is aser. And we said initially that this possibly is Rashi l'shitosai, that being involved with the Kedera Tzeinenes creates a chashash of Shema Yartiach. If the Poskim are all saying that the sheet of the Mechaber is like Rashi, that the chashash is Shema Yartiach, so in the Machloikes Rashi and the Rambam, if Hatmana is mutter on a dover tzoinen lahofik tzinosai, what would we expect to find the Shulchan Aruch paskening? We would expect the Shulchan Aruch to pasken like Rashi, that lahofik tzinosai is aser. That was the cheshbon, Rabbi Isai. The reason why Rashi is machmer and says Hatmana lahofik tzinosa is aser, not like the Rambam, is because Rashi holds that whenever you'll find k'derosai tzinenes, you'll be martiach. That was our initial approach to the sugi. If according to the Beis Yosef, Bach, Taz, Mogen Avraham, Mishnah Berurah, the reason why the Shulchan Aruch holds it's aser to be matin b'Shabbos is because Gezeira Shema Yartiach, Rashi, is then a Rashi. So what should be the din of Hatmana lahofik tzinasai? Should be aser, you're being oisik in the Kedera Tzeinenes, Chashash Shema Yartiach. Vosh state in Shulchan Aruch, page 16 of the Maramakayimis, the Sivvav. Vosh state in Shulchan Aruch. Mutter lahatmin b'Shabbos dover tzoinen b'dover shnei meisei tevel kedei shelo yitztanen b'yoser oi kedei shetofik tzinasai.
16.
Page 16, the very bottom of the Mechaber. Last 3 lines in the Shulchan Aruch on page 16. State in Shulchan Aruch mefurish that it's mutter kedei lahofik tzinasai.
Go on the Mechaber.
Fregt im Shlomo Zalman that the pashtus is that the reason why Rashi says what he says, that it's also to be matim in the lahofik tzinasai, is because Rashi is l'shitosei that on a dover tzoinen as a chashash shema yartiach. And the Achroinim are telling us that we hold that the reason why it's also lahatmin b'dover shnei meisei tevel b'Shabbos is like Rashi, the Gezeira Shema Yartiach. So how could the Shulchan Aruch say that it's mutter to be matim in the lahofik tzinasai? You're being oisik in the choim of a dover tzoinen, as they faked Shlomo Zalman. And our assumption was taka like Shlomo Zalman when we first learned the sugya together. We said the reason why Rashi holds that lahofik tzina is aser, not like the Rambam, as the Ran points out, is because it's Rashi l'shitosei that whenever you're being oisik in the Kedera Tzeinenes, there's a chashash shema yartiach. But now, Rabbi Yisrael, the way Rabbi Zalman told us that that's not true, that be'emes, the whole chashash of shema yartiach is only on a Kedera that's taken from Shehiyah into Hatmana. And therefore we said that according to Rashi, the reason why it's aser to be to Hatmana lahofik tzinosai is not because of the chashash of Shema Yartiach, but because Rashi holds it's all one gezeira of Hatmana. And once Chachamim asad the act of Hatmana, they asad even if the motivation of the act is only lahofik tzinosai. Memela, we now have a right to say that the reason why the Shulchan Aruch could paskin that Hatmana lahofik tzinosai is mutter is not be a stira to Rashi of chashash Shema Yartiach, because the actual chashash Shema Yartiach really only applies where it's taken off a shehiyah. Rashi then has an additional chiddush, unconnected to Shema Yartiach, that once Chachamim made a gezeira of Hatmana, the gezeira applies across the board. The Rambam argues, and the Rambam says the gezeira doesn't apply across the board. It only applies where the goal is to continue shehiyah into Hatmana. But where the goal is lahofik tzina, that's not Hatmana. Memela, the Shulchan Aruch could pick and choose b'shittas Rashi. The Shulchan Aruch could say, like the Mishnah Berurah says, Lo Ilam, the reason why you can't be matmin is because of Chashash Shemei Yartiach. Why by Shabbos lahafik tzinasa is mutter, is because Rashi holds the reason why it's also is because that's called a Maisa HATMANA. That's not true. The reason why I'm going to argue on Rashi and hold like the Rambam is because since we're not dealing with choyim, it's not dealing with heat, it's only lahafik tzinasa, that's not a Maisa HATMANA b'chlal. And if it's not a Maisa HATMANA, memela there's no gzeira. So to summarize, Rabbi Yisai, we began with one understanding of Shittas Rashi and we finished with another. We began with an understanding in Shittas Rashi that whenever we're being oisik in the Kedera Tzoinenes, the mitzias that the Kedera is Tzoinen creates the Chashash of Shemei Yatiach. Rabbi Zalman told us that's not correct. What creates the Chashash Shemei Yatiach is because the HATMANA is a continuation of the Shehiyah, and the Chashash is that will reverse the Shehiyah by being Mechato b'Maver Eish. We therefore initially assumed that Rashi Shita, why Hatmana lahafik tzinasi is also is because you can't be matmin a davar tzainin at chashash shemei yatiach. And now we're saying that's not true. In Shulchan Aruch, we're proving that it's not because of the chashash of shemei yatiach b'tzainin, it's because Rashi holds that a Hatmana lahafik tzinasi is similar enough to universal Hatmana that mele the shaykh gezerah on that Hatmana also, even though the actual reasoning of shemei yatiach doesn't apply. And the Rambam says, no, the hafik tzinasa is not a hatmana b'chlal. A male is mutter. And therefore the Shulchan Aruch paskins that hatmana l'hafik tzinasa is mutter. He hagam that the Achreinim tell us that the Shulchan Aruch Shita is like Rashi, that hatmana b'davar tzoinen is also shemei yatiach.
What was Rashi to that?
Of shemei yatiach? Why Rashi? He's saying why didn't Rashi learn like the Rambam? He's saying where does Rashi have a right to be mechadish that it's one surah? I don't know.
That's inherent in Ramban's kasha.
I don't know. No. He's asking. No, what's being asked is just to repeat the shaila. Is that the way Reb Shlomo Zalman understood Rashi? The reason why the hafik tzinas is mutter is because any asek with a davar tzoinin creates chashash shemei yatiach. But now that we're saying that's not mukhrach. Rashi was just mechadish as one surah of Hatmana. What was mechiriach Rashi to mechadish that we made this universal gzeira of Hatmana? I don't know what Rashi's hechrach is. It's an excellent hara. I don't know what Rashi's hechrach is. But what we can say is that what makes it easier l'shitas Rashi is that since shitas Rashi the chashash of Hatmana is on a davar tzoinen, so therefore even any davar tzoinen, even if the motivation is not to heat it, is still similar enough. What's mechiriach Rashi to the chumrah, I don't know. But what we're showing is that it's mukhrach in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch understood that this wasn't Rashi l'shitasa. To answer this kushiyat tzuma that Reb Shlomo Zalman asks. Let's just add in the time we have one more brief nekuda in Shittas Rashi. We'll leave it for the moment as a kasha, and Be'ezer Hashem in a further limud, if we can, we'll come back to be miyashav this shaila. The Gemara, back to the Gemara on page 2 of the Maramekaimus. The Gemara asks a kasha. Omalei Abaye. Abaye asks Rava a kasha. If the reason for the gzeira of Hatmana is because of the chashash of shemei yatiach, so ibazoi bein hashmasha is nami nigzor. The Mishnah says that one of the things that you're allowed to do bein hashmashas is to be matmin the chamin. Uma'arvin teimin in nesachamin. Hatmana is mutter bein hashmashas. Why? Hare hatmana is a gzeira d'Rabbanan, and the gzeira d'Rabbanan will make on bein hashmashas. Zok Rashi, but now that you said that the gzeira d'Rabbanan is based on a chashash d'oraisa of bishul, Zok Rashi, that makes it Rashi Dibur Masli Hochi ben Hashmashas Nami Nigza. Second line from the bottom. Therefore, says Rashi, Dohoshvus ma'alaisahi. This is a maliosa means a shvus which is based on a much greater chashash. Dohoika gzeras isa deraisa, and therefore we should be geyser on it ben Hashmashas. What's the Gemara's teretz? Amalei stam kederas reis chesem, says Rashi. Shesomach leben hashmashas hu ma'avira me'ala oir. Again, we have Rashi that the Hatmana means taking a shehiyah and preserving it in a Hatmana. V'lekel ameichas Hashem and itztana v'yaticha. Ben hashmashas, the kederas are, the fire is still very intense, and therefore even if it's gar from kotum, and therefore there's a lot of heat and there's no chashash that it's not reseach. Azoi state in Rashi. That's the teretz of the Gemara. Now, The Gemara has therefore established that Bein Hashmashos we can then be Mekel because there isn't a chashash of Shema Yartiach. Let's ask a basic shayla. How long into Shabbos, after Shkia or after Tzeisak Yechavim, does the Kedera stay that hot? There's no chashash Shema Yartiach. The Chayra doesn't end by the Zman. The Tzeisak Yechavim doesn't stop the Kedera being hot anymore. Let's say 2 hours. The Kira maintains its heat long enough that still for 2 hours after Bein Hashmashos, it's just for the sake of discussion, it will still be cham enough. Rashi explains, Stam Kederes Bein Hashmashos Roitzchem means Somuch Bein Hashmashos, you're taking it off the oil, that's when that one is taking place. Somuch Bein Hashmashos, the Kira is very hot.
How long does
that last for after Bein Hashmashos? 1 hour, 2 hours, something, right? Now, we know though certainly that on Shabbos, even Somuch to Bein Hashmashos, after Bein Hashmashos, you're not allowed to be matmin. Why? There's no chashash Shema Yartiach. It's doch Somuch to Bein Hashmashos. What's the problem? The answer is Chachamim Goyzer on Shabbos. If you can't be matmin Shabbos morning, you can't be matmin after the Zman. Posher. Even though there may be gradations of Chaim that get preserved into Shabbos, that would mean that not just Stam Kederes Bein Hashmashos Roischem Heim, but even after Bein Hashmashos, let's say 2 hours after the Zman, but Shabbos is Shabbos. The Chachamim Goyzer on HaIsra HATMANA b'Shabbos. Now, if that's true, so why should Bein Hashmashos be any different? Bein Hashmashos is doch weiter Shabbos. So if you see that on Shabbos we made the Gezeira and we said that even though Stam Kederes Roischem saying it's still Osir on Shabbos, that means Shabbos it's Osir. So you found a way to get out of the chashash. Why should Bein Hashmashos be different than Shabbos itself? What's other suffix? The whole kula Bein Hashmashos is that it's not a shvus ma'alaisa, right? What takes away that it's not a shvus ma'alaisa? There's no chashash bishul. What takes that away? Because Tam Keder is roish chesing. But you see on Shabbos that's not the kula. We can't just willingly take away the chashash of Shema Yartiach because on Shabbos itself avad it's also. So why should Bein Hashmashos be different? If there was something unique about Bein Hashmashos, that punkt in Bein Hashmashos, there wasn't a chashash of Shema Yartiach. Punkt. So then we can maybe say there's a unique kula of Bein Hashmashos. But Manavshach, if the shvus is also on Shabbos, and we don't say that the shvus doesn't apply to Mokum Shem because we took away the chashash of Shema Yartiach, so why should Bein Hashmashos be any different? I'm sorry? But ordinarily, we're always goyzer. Everything that's Bein Hashmashos is also Shabbos, right? Anything that's also Shabbos is also Bein Hashmashos. And the Gemara asked the kasha Bein Hashmashos, it should be also because there's a chashash of bishul. So the Gemara, no, in this case there is no chashash. Why is there no chashash?
Still hot.
Because it's still hot, which means the chashash Shema Yartiach doesn't apply. So Mela, there's no mokum for Gzeira. Now on Shabbos, Rabbi Yisai, do we willingly make off with the Gzeira of, take off the Gzeira of Shema Yartiach because it doesn't apply? No. Avada Chachamim will Geyser across the board. So Chachamim will then Geyser Bein Hashmashos also. What's the kula? We can't take away the chashash of Shema Yartiach just because b'metzias the Kedera is cham. So if that's true on Shabbos, then it's true Bein Hashmashos too. What's the difference? Lass mich fragen noch weiter. Scharfer Shai. If someone is Makabel Shabbos before this man, before Bein Hashmashos, someone's Makabel Shabbos early, could that person be matmin in Tosefes Shabbos? In Shulchan Aruch steht in Simeration and Daled. I'm sorry, in Shulchan Aruch steht in Simeration Samach Aleph. I'm sorry, the end of Simeration Samach Aleph. Kibel Olav Shabbos mi boid yoim shuv eino yochel lahatmin steht in Shulchan Aruch. It's machlekes harishonim, and the stimas of Shulchan Aruch hakaponim in Simeration Samach Aleph is, and the halacha is Isaac in this barichos. What we hold the halacha, the stias of Shulchan Aruch on this noise. What is the halacha of someone who is Makabel Shabbos early can be matmin in Zman Tosefes Shabbos? What's the din, Rabbi Yisai? Steht in Shulchan Aruch, it's Asa. In Bein Hashmashos, Stam Kederes Rois Chesem, by Tosefes Shabbos you can't. How could that be? Bein Hashmashos, Stam Kederes Rois Chesem, but in Tosefes Shabbos it's Muhammad. If the Metzias is that we aren't choishish for Shema Yartiach, the mokum that the Kedera is Reisachas. So Bein Hashmashos it's mutter, but if you Makabel Shabbos 10 minutes before Shkia, oh no, you can't anymore.
This British person is man still the answer. Here you see how this is man of Shabbos.
Well, I understand. I don't understand. Is the Metzias that there's no Chashash Shemayatiach? That's the Metzias. So how can we be more makel in Ben Hashmashas than Tesefer Shabbos? A Sofik Doiraisa that it's Shabbos, then no. But if you're Makabel Shabbos, then it's awesome. Hell. Rabbi said, just to say B'Ktzor and B'Dina and further Limud will be marchab on this. Weisduchos, you've made a fundamental mistake in understanding the Gemara. The chashash that of Shemayatiach, which is mitigated by Stam Kederis Reis Chesem, does not mean that we took away the chashash of Shemayatiach. That's wrong. We did not take away the chashash of Shemayatiach. Avada, the chashash of Shemayatiach is still there. What Stam Kederis Reis Chesem means is that since it's less likely, it's no longer a shvus ma'aliyasa. Rabbi say, what was the Gemara's kasha? The Gemara's kasha was, how could you be matter HATMANA bin hashmashas if there's a chashash of Shema Yatiach, it's an Issa Deraisa, either artificial or because of Shema Yachatim. Zok the Gemara, because it's less likely to happen, that doesn't mean we took away the Gezerah of HATMANA. Because on Shabbos, when the Kederas are Rois Chais, Avad it's also. Or but Tisefes Shabbos, it's also. Now the Nekuda is that we made the Shvus a more Shvus cow. We removed its status as a Shvus Ma'alaisa because it's less likely that there's going to be a Chashash Deraisa. In Bein Hashmoshes, we're making on a Shvus that's not a Shvus Ma'aliyasa. But into Shabbos, every Shvus is Aser. Once you're Makabel Shabbos, every Shvus is Aser. It's only in Bein Hashmoshes where there's a difference in a Shvus Ma'aliyasa and a non-Shvus Ma'aliyasa, there we make the chiluk. Rabbi said the Nekuda is, just to leave it till the end this limud with, the point of Stam Kederis Reis Chesem doesn't take away the possibility of Shema Yatiach, and therefore there's no Gezerah of HATMANA. That's not what the Gemara meant. We can't be svara, just remove the Gezerah because the Gezerah happens to be Reisachas. Otherwise, b'Shabbos it should be mutter, and otherwise it should be mutter b'Tisefes Shabbos. What it means is it's made it a less likely chashash, and therefore the shvus no longer applies with the same toikef, and therefore we can be mekel ben hashmashas. That's taken in the Gemara. We're explaining the Gemara's teretz. Right, we're explaining the Gemara's teretz. Just to finish, there's Hashem with brief divrei Haggadah that Anagea to today. Yom Tesvav Tammuz. There is a Medrash Rabbah in Esther, in Parsha Zayin. It's kimat difficult to imagine a greater contrast between the Yemei Tammuz, the Amamash Meshubah of Chored Fe'eh Sigua Ben Amitzarim and Yemei Purim, but we have a Medrash Rabbah in Esther, describing the poor that Haman was mapil, chodesh lechodesh. He was trying to find chas v'shalom a chodesh which would be masugel for Puranos to Klal Yisrael. And the Medrash brings, can come in Midrashim Ha'isik in this, why dafka the poor was noifel on chodesh Adar. So the Medrash lists different schusim that Klal Yisrael had related to each chodesh. So for chodesh Tammuz, the Medrash says like this: B'Tammuz zchus ha'aretz. In Tammuz, there's something called Zchus HaAretz, the Zchus of Eretz Yisrael. So the Radal, in his Pirush, in Chidushay Radal, he brings from the Pirush Ibn Yichya on Megillas Esther, where the Ibn Yichya says it means that B'Tammuz was the Zchus of Milchemes Yeshua B'Givon. In Seder Olam, it says that the Milchama of Yeshua with the Givonim was in Tammuz. That's a schus. Yeshua was menatzeach the Givonim. So my sedafshe in the Milchama, Memela, that schus is made. And he stated in Ibn Yichya. So the Radal says that doesn't fit well with our gears in the Medrash. That's not schus ha'aretz. Why is that schus ha'aretz? It's schus Milchemes ha'aretz maybe. What's schus ha'aretz? So Zot the Radal Davar Nifla. He says it's the schus of Aliyas Ezra v'Golusoi la'aretz b'Tammuz. In Tammuz was when Ezra took the Goyim from Bavel and returned to Eretz Yisrael to begin the Geula from Golus Bavel and to start the Binyan HaMikdash. Zog the Radal, Vu state that happened in Tammuz. Where do we know that from? How do we know that? So he says like this. He says, in Ezra it says that on the very first of Av, Ezra came back to Eretz Yisrael. Zog the Radal Ge'oinus, Aboisai. We all know the sugya. How many days does it take for the Achron of Yisrael to reach back to Eretz Pros? How long does it take? Tesvav
2 weeks.
Tesvav Yom. It's a sugya in the beginning of Tainis. Kum de Chois, he must have left Eretz. He must have left Bob in the middle of Tesvav Tammuz. Heint. Tesvav Tammuz. Heint. Zok the Radal Schusa Oretz means that Ezra was mishtoikik to be oilam mitoich golus Bovel. He had the ois to be oilam mitoich golus Bovel. To go and return to Eretz Yisrael, that was Megan on the whole of Chedesh Tammuz. That wasn't the Chedesh of the Puranos of Klal Yisrael. The Lashon of the Radal is Im Kain betesvav yoim koidem echad ba'av hu she'avar Ezra v'galusay es nahar pros v'nichnas le'Eretz Yisrael b'aliyosem mibovel dahainu b'Chedesh Tammuz. That's the Pella was stated on in the Radal. What's the Havanas Advarim? Why Taka was it that Schusa Oretz, that Ezra wanting to mistake it, to return to Eretz Yisrael, was a Schus that the Chas Hashem couldn't be a Puranos to Klal Yisrael? And remember, Rabbi said, it's Hashem Osid. The Zman Mordechai ve'Esther, this didn't happen yet. Elias Ezra Lebavel, the Gemara,
30 years later.
Yeah, the Gemara Elias Ezra really was in process right then. The Beis HaMikdash, the Binyan and Beis HaMikdash had been stopped. The original Elias Ezra had happened, but the Binyan hadn't yet been Nigmar, it had been stopped. So Ezra was oileh, but the full tikva of Klal Yisrael to be Bein HaMikdash hadn't yet happened. Ezra's aliyah wasn't yet successful. It was only the Yovesh ben Esther that many years later allowed the Binyan HaMikdash to finish. Weiss the Chois the etzem hishteki, because the rotzen of Ezra to pick up, and the Rav of Klal Yisrael remained in Bavel. Ezra pleaded with them to be oileh, but it was, Gemara says in Yuma, im alisim kachoyma, then the Rebbeinu Shalom would have been Bein Alei Atiras Kasef. But Klal Yisrael remained in Golus Bavel, Rav of them. It was Ezra's rotzen to go to Eretz Yisrael, even though at that point of Maisa Esther, it hadn't yet been fully matzliach. The Binyan Beis HaMikdash had been aborted at that point. Still, that schus was Megan. You see Rabbi say the klal, that the ikir of what's Megan in Klal Yisrael begalusam is the rotzen to once again be shavla Eretz Yisrael and have Mikdash. It's that rotzen, that hishtayk, was that Klal Yisrael has never lost. The tikva of Ovnei Yerushalayim es tzemach David Avdecha. The sechzeno yinenu b'shuvcha l'tziyim berachmim. That tikva that Klal Yisrael has never lost. That is gufa what gives Klal Yisrael the schus of schus haaretz. And in Mele Zot Radal, it was the rotzen of Ezra to be oila, Ezra v'galusay oila, which is the miyat of Klal Yisrael. In the schus that there was a Klal Yisrael that was mishteikik and went back to Eretz Yisrael, even though at that point the minyan wasn't going to be matzliach. And Klal Yisrael at that time were a miyut in terrible sorrow in Eretz Yisrael with a mikdash that hadn't yet, it wasn't even yet roy lavoida, it wasn't ischanach even. Schus haaretz. That tikva of sechzeno yinenu of tzemach David avdecha uvnei Yerushalayim. That is what's mekayim Klal Yisrael la'irich kol hagolus. Where is that Zot Radal? That's on the high yom, or that's on Yom Tezvav. The yom in which Ezra was nichnas la'aretz, the yom in which he crossed the Nahar Pros, Tezvav yomim later. It was Oim Des Hoyer Agleinu B'Shari Yerushalayim. Those Tezvav yomim began on Tezvav Tammuz. The prelude, the hakdama to the Yemei Bein HaMitzrayim. Shabbos will be Yud Zayin, the beginning of Korei Tfei Sigua Bein HaMitzrayim. What's the schus that we can have? Is the schus that we have is something called Zot Radal, the schus haaretz, which means the rotzen to have a shaychus, to eventually see back Mailas Eretz Yisrael, to eventually see back Mailas HaMikdash. That was what Ezra was giving to Klal Yisrael, the Netzach, by Ezra b'chaburasa being yotza on the Yom Tezvav Tammuz to be over the Nahar Pros. And Mele Zot Radal, that schus haaretz was Megan. That in the later Dora, that in this Bimei Mordechai ve'Esther, Klal Yisrael wasn't mitzvah l'kloya. That's what we have as man HaMikdash. I was sheiches to schus haaretz, that now that we're entering the main HaMitzrayim, shehofchu l'sasim l'simcha, but al kaponim schus haaretz,
even though it was before,
to remain mechuber to Eretz Yisrael and Mikdash.
Esther was before, correct? Mm-hmm. Even though
Esther was in the middle. Ezra was first oilet, then the Mikdash was stopped, and then afterwards was the binyan again started. Made the Yovesh ben Esther.